Hello class. This is our video on the power of the prosecutor's office for the week of January 22nd. This is Tuesday, the day after Martin Luther King Day. Happy Martin Luther King Day, belatedly. And today I want to dedicate this particular segment to just the prosecutor's office because it's such an important role. There's chapter 6 that you should have read by now that outlines the prosecutor's office. Up to today, you should have read the three roles of the judicial process: prosecutor, judge, and defense attorney. But I'm going to divide these videos into each of those parties, starting with the prosecutor's office. Now, I like to focus on that office because it really just defines how the whole system works. Think of the prosecutor as the plaintiff in a civil case, in a lawsuit. The plaintiff gets to sit down, gather evidence, decide what's strong evidence, what's not strong evidence, pick witnesses, determine strategy. Importantly, all ahead of any filing of a complaint, or in the case of a prosecutor, the filing of the criminal complaint, or the filing of an information in some states, or the bringing of a grand jury, convening of a grand jury. So there's really a lot of power at the front end, and I don't think your book mentions this as much. But at the front end, you have a situation where it's the plaintiff, and there's a lot of control of all the gears and levers and electronics, so to speak, of the judicial system, because the prosecutor gets to define the beginning of the game. He's the first mover, or she's the first mover, as it were, in a game. So again, think of the themes that we talked about in the beginning of this class, especially the sporting theory of justice. This is the first mover, the person, like in a football game, who wins the coin toss, who, however, there is no coin toss, he always or she always goes first. And there's a lot of power in that. I think as a defense attorney, I only witnessed that kind of power when I had key evidence on my side. In one particular case, I had knowledge of some witnesses that the prosecutor didn't have knowledge of, and I was able to work up the case ahead of time. But that's only happened 1 or 2 times in 13 years of defense practice. But the prosecutor gets to do that every single time, and the only thing standing in his or her way is the bureaucracy, how close she may be with the police office, with their own staff, with other state agencies or federal agencies. Depending on how close those connections work, will also determine how efficient the prosecutor is. But I'm going to assume those things work. You shouldn't always assume. But I'm going to, because I want to simply focus on those key aspects that make the prosecutor's office so important. As a side note, our case up close this week will be the Duke lacrosse player's prosecution that is in the text. So the case up close, I'll post on this, will be the case in chapter 6 of the textbook that we'll do this week of January 22nd. Now, I chose that case because it shows a prosecutor's fall from grace. The prosecutor in that case eventually was sort of removed from the case by the state attorney general, who is also a prosecutor in some states in criminal matters, and was eventually disbarred because of misconduct, including lying to the court, withholding evidence, and this sort of behavior. This rarely happens, but it shows just, first of all, the outer limits of what the prosecutor's power is, but also by defining those outer limits, we understand that there's a whole universe of power within which the prosecutor operates that really, outside of court, for example, is almost unlimited. So the mistakes the prosecutor made in this case were really in court. And the simulation that I've given you as an assignment for last week, which I think I'm still waiting for a few of you to complete those, so very, very quickly do that, because I'm going to continue to use that same simulation to illustrate the power of the prosecutor and then go on to the other parties. So the powers of the prosecutor, to get back to that, are not only being able to craft how the case unfolds in the beginning, okay, but also the prosecutor's office is frequently closely tied to the judicial branch. Even though we have a system that is supposed to be divided government, that is how it is set up in each state. You have separate offices, highly fragmented, which is probably a good thing. The text mentions that. Different levels of prosecutors' offices, the public defender, judges, but in certain realms that we'll focus on in this case, including the county judges and the state's judges, the prosecutors frequently become judges. Sometimes judges go back to prosecuting. And it's a very close link, whereas you'll rarely see a defense attorney become a judge. And there's a practical reason for this. The prosecutors know all the parties. More than any other office, they're dealing with, on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, almost all the different elements and people, offices, powers of the judicial system. So prosecutors already have this vast familiarity with the judicial landscape that allows them to become very competent jurists, that is, judges. That's the fancy word for judges. And so it's just natural, even though it seems like it's unfair. For the defense attorney, I kind of felt that way sometimes. I grew out of that. It's just natural that a prosecutor or a state attorney general would become a judge. In order for the defense attorney to become a judge, the defense attorney would have to be similarly highly involved in proposing legislation with judges, going to luncheons, operating at a high level. And you only see a handful of those doing that have big budgets. But those are the ones that get to know the judges on a first-name basis. But even so, they don't get that sort of fast track to the judicial power because they're sort of always have been the kind of bad guy of the judicial system, if you will. The really good defense attorneys that even are hobnobbing with judges and prosecutors will be constantly creating trouble as well, but the trouble that they create is always legal, and it's always something that benefits their clients. It's just harder to run a political campaign with that kind of background in a country like ours than it would be for a prosecutor to run a political campaign to get elected as a prosecutor. So that's a big power. So a lot of them are gunning for the office of a judge in a particular state or county, and so they want to be extremely competent at making all these different offices and personnel and procedures work out perfectly. So for example, the first thing you want to do if you're a prosecutor is know every single rule that applies to your jurisdiction and beyond the jurisdictions that you deal with on a regular basis. You might have to learn federal law, even if you're a state prosecutor, depending on how aggressive your federal prosecutor is. But you definitely want to learn the rules of procedure for the state, for the particular court, the nuances of each particular judge. I cannot tell you the amount of time I have seen a young prosecutor enter court as a defense attorney watching and seeing that person offend the judge simply because they had not learned that particular judge's procedures beforehand. Okay? So, but assuming all that, the prosecutor is competent and to operate in that fashion. Their role is very special because of this power they have. A really good prosecutor who wants to have a career that's ethical and lasts as long as they want their career to last will be very careful to not just be a zealous attack dog for the people against the criminally accused, right? You definitely have to have that personality. I remember of that famous book by Scott Turow called Presumed Innocent, where his quote in that is that the prosecutor must always point at the defendant and appear to be outraged and to be right and just, even though half the time it's not actually the case that they are that way. But that's important because that's their role. But beyond that zealous personality and drive, there also has to be a very level-headed appreciation for the fact that often the police get things wrong. The budget of the state is strapped. Judges are in a hurry to make decisions, so that the prosecutor's presentation of the state's case can be full of misleading information if the prosecutor is not on top of that could persuade a judge to make the wrong decision. And I've seen that happen so many times, and I've rarely seen the prosecutor caught on it. But if you're ever going to become a prosecutor, don't take that for granted, because I have seen the rare aggressive judge call the prosecutor out on their mistakes. So the prosecutor has to really have not just the interest of the people who are victims, The prosecutor has to have the interest of all of society, much like a judge would have, because they don't want to be falsely accusing people. We've seen too much of that. TV shows are starting to highlight how that happens. We don't want to miss the real bad guy who got away, right? And we also don't want to sully the reputation of the prosecutor's office, who is eternal. It's always going to be there. That personnel might leave, who's the prosecutor at the time, but the prosecutor's office is always going to be there. So in order to have effective prosecutions, efficient prosecutions, good staff morale like a military operation, the prosecutor has to be kind of like a general. They have to be magnanimous towards the enemy as well as towards the judiciary, as well as aggressive against the criminally accused. And this will wrap up my short talk on the prosecutor, but if any of you are thinking about prosecutors' careers, it's an extremely rewarding career. I did it for a while. And it was one reason I switched to a defense attorney is I found that burden of not being just zealous, but also being a caretaker of the government's reputation, of justice in the broader sense for all parties, and lawful disclosure of evidence so that everything works appropriately, even if it risks you losing the case. I found it not to be sort of my personality. I was more like the gunslinger, and I wanted to be on the side that had a little more options at its disposal, and that was simply a matter of style choice. So I spent most of my time being a defense attorney, only a few years being a prosecutor. But I can see how being a prosecutor could be highly rewarding for somebody who's the other personality, who wants to get things right, who wants to be a kind of caretaker for the reputation of society and the government and the judiciary. And you do your job right, and you will become a judge. It's actually extraordinarily easy if you're affable, if you make good professional relations, if you know how to finance a budget, to become a judge only after a few years of highly competent prosecutorial work. Of course, it's also a popularity contest, but that's one of the reasons people become prosecutors. The prosecutors who are civil servants I really admire because they're doing that for their entire career, and it's a very hard, arduous process. And if you're that kind of person who's a warrior, who always wants to be in the trenches, the prosecutor's office in the long term is for you as well, because there's no better place to see every aspect of life and at least have a chance to do justice in as many as possible, though things will not always be in your control. But never underestimate the awesome power that the prosecutor has, that power has to be handled very carefully if you want to be effective. I once mentioned in one of my previous videos that the most effective prosecutors were the ones that knew all the defense angles of attack. Because as in the gaming theory of criminal justice, or the sporting theory, I shouldn't say gaming, the sporting theory of criminal justice, the prosecutor can have an airtight case because they can control much of the way a prosecution is brought, or they can at least proceed with the weaker cases to plea bargain them and just focus on the stronger ones to go to trial. If they know how to do that, then the most skillful and the most rewarding prosecutorial experiences is those who are aware not just of their case, but what the other chess moves are going to be on the other side of the table. Because I've seen that happen on rare occasions, but it makes for a very well-rounded attorney. The attorney that's like that in the prosecutor's office does not get full of themselves. They're very affable, but yet they exercise power because they know how to win a case, because they know how to close all the loopholes that the defense attorney might be exploiting. And that's the way the system should work. Because if you really have a good case, you'll bring it and you'll support it in an aggressive manner. Prosecutors should be aggressive like that, but also level-headed because of this enormous power that they wield. And I will now go in my next video to the office of the judge to illustrate how independence from the prosecution is very important, and how the prosecution actually working in tandem with the judge's office makes for an important element of the judicial process. Thank you.